Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Avery. In this video I discuss the death penalty and particularly why I am opposed to it. I didn't always feel that way, so I'll be discussing my evolution away from being a proponent of the death penalty to being staunchly opposed to it. To describe my initial support for the death penalty, I shall discuss a series of murders that occurred in the early to mid-1960s in the northwest of England, the so-called Moors murders committed by Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. After that discussion, I'll explain what I believe to be a far superior punishment and why I'm convinced that it is superior to execution. In October 1965, the police received a phone call from one David Smith, who told them that the evening before he had witnessed a horrific murder. He also gave them the address where it happened, 16 Wardlebrook Avenue. The police collected him from the phone box from which he had made the call, took him to Hyde Police Station, where Smith described in vivid detail the events of the previous evening. He advised the police that he had been invited to the Wardlebrook Avenue house to help Brady with something. That something was to help dispose of the body of the person Brady was going to kill in front of Smith, believing that Smith would go along with it out of fear of prosecution. The police went to the house and discovered the mutilated body of Edward Evans locked up in a spare bedroom. Brady was immediately arrested and taken to Hyde Police Station. Hindley was not arrested, but presumably because the police did not believe that a woman could be involved in such a horrific murder. Interrogation of Brady convinced the police that Hindley was also involved in the murder of Evans and possibly other victims. On the 11th of October 1965, Hindley was also arrested. During a search of the house at Wardlebrook Avenue, the police found an exercise book with the name John Kilbride on it. John, aged 12, had disappeared on the 23rd of November 1963 and had never been seen again. Finding that exercise book led the police to believe that Brady and Hindley were responsible for John's disappearance, and also that other children missing in the area. There were 4 children missing: Pauline Reed, aged 16, John Kilbride, aged 12, Keith Bennett, aged 12, and Leslie Ann Downey, aged 10, all of whom, along with the last victim, Edward Evans, should be remembered. A warning. What I'm about to discuss is disturbing, so you may want to fast forward to the like and subscribe screen at the end of this section. On the 12th of July 1963, Pauline Reed was lured to her death by Hindley when she was stopped in the street and asked to help find a very expensive glove that Hindley had lost on Saddleworth Moor. She was taken to the moor where she was raped and murdered. She had a number of cuts to her throat and had been nearly decapitated. Her body was buried in a shallow grave on the moor. On the 23rd of November 1963, John Kilbride disappeared. Again, Hindley was the person who selected the victim, this time by offering him a bottle of sherry. Once Kilbride was in the van, Brady suggested that they head out to the moor to look for that very expensive glove. On the moor, Brady sexually assaulted a boy, tried to slit his throat with a 6-inch serrated knife, but eventually strangled him with a shoelace or a piece of string. Just like Reed, he was buried on the moor. On the 16th of June 1964, Keith Bennett disappeared. For the 3rd time, Hindley was the bait. She asked Bennett to help her load some boxes into her minivan, after which she would drive him home. Brady was in the back of the van. They drove to Saddleworth Moor, where Brady sexually assaulted the boy and strangled him with a piece of string. On the 26th of December 1964, Leslie Ann Downey disappeared. Hindley deliberately dropped some shopping she was carrying and asked Downey for help in taking the packages to the car. This, I say, is the most depraved of the 5 murders Brady and Hindley had committed. Downey was taken to the Brady home where she was stripped, gagged, forcibly posed for photographs, sexually assaulted and killed, possibly by strangulation with string. The attack was recorded on a reel-to-reel audio tape recorder where the voices of Brady and Hindley can be heard, along with Downey screaming and begging for mercy. It later came to light that Brady and Hindley used to have sex listening to the recording of Downey's rape, torture and murder. The last victim was Edward Evans. Evans was the only victim that wasn't selected by Hindley. Brady picked him up allegedly for a sexual encounter. He was hacked to death with a hatchet in front of David Smith, Hindley's cousin, and was the victim that led to the arrest of the murderers. Brady and Hindley led the police to the bodies of Reed, Kilbride and Downey. Evans' body was found at the Wardlebrook Avenue address. Despite extensive searches, Keith Bennett's body has never been found. His mother, Winnie, passed away in 1991, having never been able to lay her son to rest. If you like what I have to say, please hit like, subscribe and ring that notification bell. Comments, positive and negative, are welcome. Add them below and I'll do my best to respond. Thank you. Brady and Hindley were tried at Chester Assizes starting on the 16th of April 1966, with a guilty verdict being reached after a 2-hour deliberation on 14 days later on the 6th of May 1966. Although the death penalty was still under statute, the judge, Mr. Justice Fenton Atkinson, could not impose it because there was a moratorium on that penalty in place. He therefore imposed life sentences with a whole life tariff, the UK's version of life without parole, on Brady and Hindley to be served concurrently. The death penalty was finally abolished in the UK in 1969. Hindley died in prison on the 15th of November 2002 and Brady in prison on the 15th of May 2017. Although I was only 14 and a half years old, like very many other people in the UK at the time, I was outraged by the penalty. Like those people, I believe that Brady and Hindley deserved death. Over the ensuing years, there were other murders where I was convinced the perpetrators should be executed. Between 1970 and 1974, Ronald Jebson murdered 3 children. Between 1975 and 1980, Peter Sutcliffe murdered 13 women. Between 1978 and 1983, Dennis Nilsson murdered at least 12 young men. And between 1985 and 1986, John Duffy raped and murdered 3 women. All were sentenced to life in prison, but in each case at the time, I believe they should have been executed. I believed that all murderers deserved death, but I no longer hold that position, so what led me to change my mind? In the mid-1980s, I learned of the story of Timothy Evans, an innocent man who was hanged on the 9th of March 1950 for a murder he never committed. The actual murderer, John Christie, was hanged on the 15th of July 1953, having been convicted of 8 counts of murder. Learning about the unjust execution of Evans piqued my interest and led me to search out similar stories. 20-year-old Derek Bentley was executed on the 28th of January 1953 for the murder of a policeman during a burglary. It was his partner in crime, 16-year-old Christopher Craig, who actually shot a police officer. When challenged by the officer to drop the gun, Bentley allegedly called out, "Let him have it!" Craig shot the officer dead. At his trial, Bentley stated that he meant hand over the gun. That claim wasn't accepted by the jury, who convicted him and Craig after only 75 minutes of deliberation. Craig was sentenced to life in prison. The Home Secretary refused to grant clemency to Bentley, which was hugely controversial. After a 40-year-long campaign, Bentley was posthumously pardoned in 1993 and a murder conviction overturned in 1998. Needless to say, a posthumous pardon and overturning of his conviction was, in reality, meaningless, because Bentley went to the gallows knowing he was innocent of the murder and was being unjustly executed. I learned about Bentley when I read Gangland, the case of Bentley and Craig, authored by Francis Selwyn, where I learned that he was executed for a murder he didn't commit. Reading this book put the final nail in the coffin of my support for the death penalty. Other people executed for murders they did not commit include Cameron Willingham in 1992, Reuben Cantu in 1993, Larry Griffin in 1995, Carlos de Luna in 1989, David Spence in 1997, Jesse Tafero in 1996, and 2 brothers, Thomas and Meeks Griffin, in 1915. A doctrine in the USA holds that dates back to 1769 states that the law holds that it is better that 10 guilty persons escape than 1 innocent person suffer. A wise man once said, "Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death in judgment." Kudos to those who recognize that reference. Both statements confirm my belief that the death penalty should never be implemented and that our life sentences be imposed instead. The motives for a murder are wide, according to a report from the Australian Institute of Criminology published in 2005. The commonest motive is a domestic argument. See the link in the description below. Bryn Donovan lists 15 motives for murder. Link also in the description. Numbers 2, 6, 7, 13 and 14 in Donovan's list involve the murder of a spouse or partner. I admit that I have no empirical evidence to back me up, but given that the commonest motive for murder is something domestic, while I believe that they should serve a long time in prison, I'm not convinced that those murderers should be given life without the possibility of parole. I often see and hear people saying that this paedophile or that murderer should be executed, and I do understand that reaction. It's visceral, but in my opinion, it isn't a well thought out position. I am convinced that there are murderers who should never breathe free air again. Serial killers like Ian Brady, Peter Sutcliffe and Dennis Nilsen in the UK, Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer in the US, Ivan Milat and John Bunting in Australia, and of course, terrorists. There is very little hope that such people could ever be rehabilitated, so why do I believe that they should be incarcerated for life rather than executed? Consider Ian Brady, probably the UK's most notorious serial killer. Born on the 2nd of January 1938, convicted on the 6th of May 1966, aged 28, and died 51 years later on the 15th of March, he served a total of 18,637 days in prison. I can think of nothing better punishment to be confined in a 6x8 cell for 23 hours a day, every day of the week, for the rest of your life, being woken up every day at the same time, never being allowed to sleep in, being told when you can go for breakfast, when you can get lunch, when you can have dinner, having to ask permission to go to the toilet, and in the case of someone like Brady, having to be escorted to and from the toilet. Not being able to take a day off to go to the beach, the cinema, a restaurant, see your spouse or kids whenever you want, go to the library, out shopping, watch the TV whenever you want. Being told it's time for the lights to go out and for you to go to sleep. A lifetime of boredom, a lifetime of little ever changing, a lifetime where you can think about how you have wasted the only life you'll ever get, a lifetime of thinking about what you could have done. I'll leave you to consider these thoughts. Execution is merciful, it is not justice, because for that person, it's over. Meanwhile, the families and loved ones of the murderer's victims have to live the rest of their lives without their loved one. Personally, I would feel much better knowing that if someone I loved was murdered, their murderer would spend the rest of their lives living it as I have just described. Lastly, although we should remember the evil done by serial killers, it isn't them who should be remembered, it's their victims. If you like what I have to say, please hit like, subscribe and ring that notification bell. Comments, positive and negative, are welcome. Add them below and I'll do my best to respond. Thank you.